If he'd only gotten his sightseeing done by himself, Tom thought, if only he hadn't been in such a hurry and so greedy, if he only hadn't misjudged the relationship between Dickie and Marge so stupidly, or had simply waited for them to separate of their own volition, then none of this would have happened, and he could have lived with Dickie for the rest of his life. Traveled and lived and enjoyed living for the rest of his life, if only he hadn't put on Dickie's clothes that day. I understand, Tommy boy, I really do, Peter said, patting his shoulder. Tom looked up at him through distorting tears. He was imagining traveling with Dickie on some liner back to America for Christmas holiday, imagining being on good terms with Dickie's parents, as if he and Dickie had been brothers.
Hello, dear listeners. Bagg here. And what you're about to hear is mine and Jesse's conversation, a repost of episode 4 of Upper Middlebrow, when we talked about the second half of Patricia Highsmith's 1955 novel, The Talented Mr. Ripley. Jesse and I are both kind of obsessed with Ripley as a character and also in the way that he seems to really have a hold on the American imagination, as evidenced by the fact that Netflix just released its miniseries, Ripley, starring Anthony Scott, who, as Jesse pointed out last time, was marvelously creepy as Moriarty in the BBC series Sherlock. But my favorite role of his was as the hot priest from Phoebe Waller-Bridge's Fleabag, in which he absolutely played this amazingly understated character that I think Scott really does an absolutely amazing job of. Ripley is still ongoing, and Jesse and I are watching our way through it, and it may even become a Upper Middlebrow episode in the next few weeks and months. But we wanted to bring it back up because we think that Ripley is once again having a moment here in the American zeitgeist, and we wanted to talk about it. This episode is from pretty early on in our process, and we have a few audio issues in this particular episode that was mostly due to me being a novice in the recording world. Please forgive some of the echoes and the sounds that you're going to hear today. And we have cut out the ramble during this repost, but if you want to go and hear Jesse and I compare our 1960s and 1980s food processors in a non-visual medium, then by all means, head on back to episode 4 of the Upper Middlebrow feed and go and have a listen. And then, without further ado, here is our conversation about the second half of Patricia Highsmith's 1955 novel, The Talented Mr. Ripley. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Okay, here we are. We are doing the second half of The Talented Mr. Ripley by the masterful Patricia Highsmith. And as we do every night when we have this show, we are going to stumble through a second half recap of this book. I think you had to go first last time. I'm not going to look at my notes. I know that you don't look at your notes for this. So I'll kind of get things going.
Although if there ever was a plot where you might want notes, this might be it.
Yeah, I had to take some notes this morning, mostly to back up what I'm going to try to say during the episode today.
Sure.
Yeah, we pick up with Tom Ripley having just disposed of poor Freddie Miles, who was getting wise to Tom's shenanigans. And was maybe starting to figure things out. So Tom has killed Freddie and kind of wrestles his body down the stairs after the sun has gone down, pretending that Freddie is drunk, gets him in a car, deposits him somewhere out of town, and then returns
on the Appian Way, no less.
On the Appian Way, yes, exactly. Patricia Highsmith, no stranger to wanting to get in kind of tourist attractions in the books. I love that these books are like a tourist's guide to horror.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Do you want to go to beautiful places in Europe and kill people?
I mean, arguably she's following in somewhat backwards, but following backwards the footsteps of Agatha Christie in that regard too.
We talked about this last time, how this is kind of a mystery in reverse, which
Yeah.
is kind of impressive that she has kind of invented a genre. But anyway, we get back to at the moment, Tom is staying in a hotel or an apartment.
Apartment, I believe.
We're in Rome.
Well, no, he moved out of Dickie's apartment into a hotel.
He does after he talks to the police.
Yeah.
Police come and talk to
That's
him
right. All right.
in
So he's
Dickie's
in
apartment.
And it's very important. He is pretending still to be Dickie at this point.
Exactly. Yeah. Fausto, his Italian teacher from Mongebello, shows up, and Tom has to kind of put him off, even though Fausto is very insistent, and puts him off and manages to not allow Fausto to come up. An investigator arrives. Tom also answers a call from a character named Van Houten, who's sort of super sad about Freddie's murder. Tom asks the investigators if he can travel to Majorca. The investigators say, no, we'd really prefer if you stay in Italy. And Tom kind of takes advantage of that to remove to Naples, I believe, on his way to Sicily. He does get the investigators do ask him about the boat, which has been discovered in San Remo, the boat that Tom killed Dickie in. As Tom heads off to Sicily, I will kick it on back to you.
Yeah, and I will have to say, like, I read a lot of this a couple weeks ago, and it's really hard for me to remember the details because one version of this plot could just be Tom visits several cities in Italy and then goes to Greece, the end. Like, that is one way of describing the second half of the book. There is some, people wrangling that he has to do. If I remember correctly, though, he goes to Sicily, or maybe it's Sardinia, and there he's still impersonating Dickie, and he continues doing some forgeries, and he continues writing some letters, but he makes sure that he's seen there as Dickie, as a kind of alibi for Dickie still being alive at this point, because he's starting to come to the conclusion in his head that he's probably going to have to make it look. He can't go on pretending to be Dickie forever. Eventually, he'll get caught at that because somebody who actually knows Dickie will show up. And so at some point, Dickie will have to vanish. So he kind of makes sure he's seen there and writes some letters and things like that to establish that Dickie was in Sicily. I think it was Sicily. And then, if I'm remembering correctly, he decides he's going to go to Venice. And he is a little bit nervous, and I think he's kind of wondering, like, is this just gonna be like every other place where you go there and you think it's gonna be great and it's kind of terrible? But very quickly he actually is sort of like, I really like Venice. And if I'm remembering correctly, he goes to Venice as Tom Ripley. And there's this moment, and it's actually one of my favorite passages in the second half, where he is sad about going from being Dickie to Tom Ripley. And this is a moment too, though, where in going to Venice, I can't remember if he has like a little brief stay over in Paris too on his way to Venice.
Not in Paris. He stops in Trento.
Is that where he has a nice dinner?
He buys a car in the north of Italy, and
Right.
has a nice dinner and sort of spends a night in the car and marks up a guidebook to make it look as if he has been kind of kicking around the north of Italy while Dickie has been in the south,
right,
murdering Freddie Miles.
Is Tom Ripley's alibi he's now establishing. That's right. And by buying the car, he's establishing that basically the entire winter from the time Tom and Dickie left San Remo, that Tom was just kind of wandering around in northern Italy with a car.
I'm gonna kind of press fast forward in a similar way that you kind of mentioned. This is Tom in Italy dealing with loose ends. While I was doing my plot mapping this morning, there's a section from chapter 19 to chapter 28 that the plot arc that I set for that section is simply called tying up little loose ends.
Mm-hmm.
Tom, while he's in Italy, he discovers that Tom Ripley, has gone missing. That is written in the newspaper. And he has this impulse at first to go and reveal himself right away. And then it's like, oh, no, I shouldn't do that. I should wait until it's in a few more newspapers, which he does. And this kind of helps establish his alibi that he's been kicking around in the North, and he has been out of contact and hadn't heard anything about what's been going on. He's pretty much trying to get the police to think that Dickie murdered Freddie pretty much through reverse psychology, by trying to get them to think that there's no way that Dickie would have done anything like this, while he's continuing to add clues that in fact Dickie did kill Freddie. There's a real subplot in this book where Tom imagines that it is Dickie who killed Freddie, because it was Tom play acting as Dickie at that moment. Marge may be a problem, as Tom begins to kind of test run this idea that Dickie killed himself. And Marge arrives in Venice, where Tom thinks that he might actually have to kill Marge as well. And he goes to some parties. Mr. Greenleaf shows up in Venice. Marge discovers Dickie's rings in one of the bags that Tom has. And Tom says, oh, he gave those to me. He seemed really down, and Marge thinks, oh, maybe he really did kill himself. A private investigator that Mr. Greenleaf has hired shows up from America and does some investigating and interrogating. I'll let you wrap up the last couple of chapters.
The other thing that does happen plot-wise is at one point he has to meet with a couple of police officers who were the same police officers who interrogated him when he was pretending to be Dickie. And it's interesting. I think it's kind of a stand-in for how Patricia Highsmith is trying to make us believe that Tom gets away with this, because we're meant to understand that Tom basically is able to transform himself back to Tom Ripley. He darkens his hair a little bit. He had dyed it, but he basically just changes his posture and his way of speaking. And it's one of those things where it's like, that seems unlikely. And yet, I think this is one of those moments where the author is just asking us to believe something, and I guess we just have to believe it. And we have to understand that Tom is good at this kind of thing. So there's a moment where he's interviewed by those two police officers, and they don't recognize that he's the same guy they talked to several months earlier. So that happens. Mr. Greenleaf has shown up, as you said. And basically Tom's strategy for getting away with this murder is convincing everybody that Dickie killed himself, which isn't a very good strategy, and yet it seems to be working. But then Tom does a couple things, and one is the police are no longer saying he can't leave. He decides to go to Greece. He really wants to go to Greece. And another thing that happens is he gets really, really bold, and I think when he was in Sicily, he had written a will in Dickie's handwriting and put it in an envelope that said, do not open till June or something like that. And so now he writes a letter to the Greenleafs, who have gone home, and says, I don't know what to do. I just found this will. It's so strange, but your son, Dickie, who died under mysterious circumstances and really only saw me among very few other people during that time, seems to have left all of his money to me. Weird. I don't know what to do about this. And then, actually very cleverly, I think, gets on the boat for Greece, sort of drops that bomb, and then doesn't stick around. And he goes to Greece, and he befriends this older lady, and Tom seems kind of happy for once in his life. And he is also reflecting on how much luck he's had getting away with these two murders recently, which I think is a little bit of lampshading on the part of Patricia Highsmith. So there's a little bit of that going on. And then he shows up in Greece and he's expecting to be arrested, and he's not arrested, and he gets a letter from the Greenleaf saying, we're not surprised that Dickie left you his money, and we're going to go ahead and make sure you get the money. And that's pretty much the end of the book, as I recall.
Bean.
Yeah.
You and I used to have a joke back when we lived in Maine together, and there was a real possibility that we would kind of see each other regularly. And we had this wonderful joke where we would say "El año próximo" in Brunswick, or like insert some like northeastern place that was not Havana, which is what that saying is supposed to be. El año próximo in Havana.
Or I mean, I think as we would perhaps say at Passover next year in Jerusalem.
And my joke subtitle about this book is El Año Próximo and Greece. Because God damn it, if Greece is not this like white whale for Tom, that there's this like all through the book, there has been this like, Greece. Maybe we're going to finally get to Greece.
Well, remember Dickie wanted to go there too and buy a house there.
That's true. That is a very good point. That's probably where I'd forgotten that, but I think that is where that is coming from. But you've got an observation here about Henry James's novel, The Ambassadors.
Actually, you referred to this novel as a kind of mystery novel in reverse. Last time. And you said part of what you think some of the weaknesses are is that it's not necessarily a very good mystery novel in reverse because the suspense around whether or not Tom is going to get away with it, which is what the second half of the book about, is actually not very suspenseful. And I think I probably mostly agree with that too. Although I will point out the novel that made Patricia Highsmith famous, which had been published just a year or two before this one, was Strangers on a Train, where a somewhat sympathetic character commits a murder, seems like he's going to get away with it for the entire second half of the book, and then does not. And so perhaps Patricia Highsmith was leaning in the expectations set by that novel a little bit too. Maybe that would be a little bit more suspenseful. But my observation about The Ambassadors is I actually really think that one way of looking at this novel is it is sort of a coming-of-age novel, not unlike something like Great Expectations or Oliver Twist or The Goldfinch or even The Ambassadors. And really, if you look at the plot of The Ambassadors, I haven't actually read The Ambassadors. I don't know. Have you read it?
I've not read it. I definitely went and did like a pretty thorough kind of like plot investigation, and I was like, oh wow, this is very similar. Me too.
And if it's so basically in The Ambassadors, a man is sent to Europe to try to bring a wayward son back by a wealthy woman. In this case, the man is actually engaged to this woman, and he's quite a bit older. I think he's in his 50s. But when he gets to Europe, he's maybe intending to try to do that, but he actually finds that he rather likes Europe, and he rather likes the young man's life there, and he gets brought into that person's social scene and really sort of discovers more about who he is and how he wants to live. And is given the opportunity to kind of climb the social ladder while there. So it's really the same novel in that sense. Although it's also really not, because there's no murder in The Ambassadors. And also, interestingly, though, I think it's interesting that both novels start in a very similar way in that they also... In both novels, the plans actually go awry in interesting ways, which is, I think, what give both novels their juice and their interest. But I do think you can see this novel plot-wise, and maybe it's a little bit more interesting if you're trying to see this novel's virtues. If you think of the second half as Tom becoming more comfortable with Tom, I think that's actually the most interesting part of the second half of the book, and that is sort of part of what happens. And it's tragic because the way he becomes more comfortable is by murdering somebody, impersonating him, and stealing his wealth. but it's also, there's something triumphant about that too, and it reminds me a little bit of that short story. Um, oh, it's the Russian Chekhov's short story. I think, is it Chekhov? It's about the woman who is like riding the spring
Oh,
roads.
in the cart.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me a
And
little bit of that. I think it's Chekhov too, right? And basically, not much happens except for at the very end, she has this moment where suddenly she becomes a little bit more comfortable with who she is, and it's believable in that moment.
and then it's gone. It's
And
horrible.
yeah,
It's so Chekhovian. There's
well,
this like the sun, like there's like this brief moment of sun that like I think a train is passing. Like
the
she has
train
to
is
stop at a
passing, and
train
she
crossing.
sees a woman who looks like her mother, and the sun has lit her up beautifully. And she suddenly remembers being on the train station 20 years ago in Moscow when she was a beautiful young woman.
Oh, it's too much. It's too
Yeah,
sad.
yeah, yeah.
Do you have a section that sort of leaps off of what you were talking
Sure,
about of
sure.
Tom
Yeah,
kind of becoming himself?
I do actually. I have one marked. Okay, so he's on the boat headed for Greece, and he sent the will, the forged will, I should say, to Dickie's parents. And he's been enjoying just kind of walking this old lady, Mrs. Cartwright, around the deck every night and talking with her and her daughter. And they kind of bicker a little bit. And Tom has become kind of like a little pet of this woman. And one's not sure if he even really likes the daughter. He just likes the old lady, it seems like. Maybe Mrs. Cartwright had been a hellcat in her youth, Tom thought. Maybe she was responsible for every one of her daughter's neuroses. Maybe she had clutched her daughter so closely to her that it had been impossible for the daughter to lead a normal life and marry. And maybe she deserved to be kicked overboard instead of walked around the deck and listened to for hours while she talked. But what did it matter? Did the world always mete out just desserts? Had the world meted his out to him? He considered that he had been lucky beyond reason in escaping detection for 2 murders, lucky from the time he had assumed Dickie's identity until now. If the first part of his life, fate had been grossly unfair, he thought, the period with Dickie and afterwards had more than compensated for it. And something was going to happen now in Greece, he felt, and it couldn't be good. His luck had held just too long. But supposing they got him on the fingerprints and on the will, and they gave him the electric chair. Would that death in the electric chair equal in pain? Or could death itself at 25 be so tragic that he could not say that the months from November until now had not been worth it? Certainly not.
What a monster. My God. I really hope Patricia Highsmith's life was not terrible.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I think she was very uncomfortable for much of her life. Although yeah, I don't know. It's a good question.
It's an amazing passage because you're right. Like it's one of the few times that we see Tom comfortable with himself, and he has missed the fucking point about fate. Like,
Well,
yeah, I mean, like, has the world meted out it's just desserts to him? No, no. Like the just desserts are you getting caught, you like identity thieving murderous asshole. I mean, like, I think the place where we maybe differ on this book is that I just hate this person.
yeah.
And I do not root for him in any way. I was surprised how much I was rooting for him to get caught and being frustrated with the dramatic irony that I knew he was not going to get caught. And that made it sort of pleasant in a melancholy kind of way, the way that I would enjoy like a Chekhov book where it's like it is heartbreaking and sad.
Yeah.
But it's like perverted and flip-flopped.
To me, that passage really reminds me of Friedrich Nietzsche's argument in what I think how I understood his argument in The Birth of Greek Tragedy, where he was basically, as I understood it, he was saying the Greeks liked stories where terrible things happened to good people because what it meant was that it didn't matter if you were good or bad, or it didn't matter if you did what the gods wanted you to do. That fate had no relationship to morality, and therefore we were all free. And I think Tom's having a similar realization. I think he's feeling free, and you're right. He doesn't deserve it, but it is also kind of interesting to me that it's sort of like this taking this reckless act, doing these terrible things, and getting away with them. It's the portrait of somebody realizing who he is and how he wants to live. And he even decides, even if I don't get away with it, it was worth it. And there's something profound there, even if it's profoundly bad.
I mean, this is the flip-flop of a Greek tragedy. Good things are happening to terrible people.
There you go. Yeah.
And again, as much as I dislike Tom Ripley, like I keep coming back to this, hats off to Patricia Highsmith. Because she's not only a master craftswoman in terms of her sentences. I mean, she has really got under my skin with Tom Ripley, and has sort of done something. You spend the book being like, no, like he's going to get away again, and it's pretty impressive that that's what she decided to go after.
Well, can I ask? Is part of your horror with Tom Ripley... Well, let me back up. That passage you read last time, where he decides to kill Dickie, was actually one of my least favorite passages the first time I read the book. When I read it the second time, I think I saw more of what you saw in it, which was like a pretty accurate and horrific walking through of the kind of rationalization some people can do around bad behavior. So I'm curious, though. So part of the reason I didn't like it is it just didn't resonate with me at all. You know, I was used to the Matt Damon, Anthony Minghella movie where, yes, Tom Ripley is angry at Dickie. Yes, he's jealous. Yes, he has an unrequited attraction and he's feeling anger about that. But he doesn't actually mean to kill him. That's sort of an accident. And when he does it, he feels terrible about it, which I actually think is kind of relatable. And maybe in my mind, a more relatable story than choosing to kill your like best friend of 6 weeks ago just because you're kind of pissed, you know, and want to take his rings. So part of the reason I didn't like that passage so much the first time was that it just didn't feel relatable to me. It just felt like it was out of the blue. Reading it the second time with the subtext of Tom's sublimated homosexuality and his attraction, I could see it coming more clearly this time, and it made a lot more sense. But I guess is part of your revulsion that Ripley seems all too real to you?
Yes. Short answer.
What's the long? Can you give me the long answer? Is it too personal?
No, it's not. It's not just personal. There's aspects of it that are personal. I mean, I think we all have done premeditated things in our lives that we are not proud of. And when we go back and examine those things, I think we do a lot of justification. Like, oh, this happened and that happened. And I think what is so chilling about that passage is that we're watching that happen in real time. We're watching Tom come up with the idea and then begin justifying it in the moment. And I think we've all done things like that, all things that we it's not as far as murder and identity theft, but you realize that Highsmith is probably trying to raise the stakes to a point where we're actually going to pay attention. I mean, this is a book about kind of bad decisions on top of bad decisions that eventually turn out right. And I think personally, having tried to come back from a lot of the bad decisions in my life and learn from them, watching somebody make those bad decisions and then be rewarded for them, like, strikes at the heart of what I find really offensive. And I think there's a lot of that in the world. I mean, the world is unfair, and a lot of times people are rewarded for bad behavior. And I think it's impressive that in the middle 50s that Patricia Highsmith kind of wanted to talk about.
Well, let me then ask you, is this a great writer choosing to write a book about a character who does not deserve to be a protagonist, and you're offended by that? Or is it a great writer and a great book? It's just a book that makes you very uncomfortable.
It's almost a great book. He's a great writer, a good book, and a character that makes me uncomfortable. The reason it's not a great book is the plot and narrative structure of the second half.
And what could be done then? I mean, what if it was, is it simply a matter of there's all sorts of plotting things you could do to put him in more jeopardy and make it seem like he's going to get caught more. Like he could, and in fact, the Minghella movie does that, right? Like puts him in contact with people who think, he's in a situation where there's somebody over there who knows him as Tom Ripley and there's someone over there who thinks he's Dickie Greenleaf and he has to deal with that. Or put him in a situation where he might get caught in one of his lies. Or the cops... The Italian police could even look at his fucking registration papers, which all you have to do is be like, oh, Mr. Signor Ripley, may I see your registration?
Yes.
It says that it was done in May, but you say that you were traveling around the north in February in this very same car. Why is your, or they could be like, can you produce one single hotelier who has seen you in the north of Italy? Can you remember the name of one single city where you stayed in one? We'll go and, they could have caught him. There's plenty of evidence against him if they had only looked. So would have making his peril greater made it a better book? Yes.
My problem with the second half of this book, whenever you're escalating tension, in each chapter, you want to escalate one main plot thread tension and probably a secondary plot tension. So like the big thrust of what you're working on, you do need to escalate the tension there. And then maybe like a secondary plot tension, maybe escalate that too, but probably not every chapter, because then you're just turning every dial every chapter.
It would get fatiguing, right? It would just
exactly. Yeah.
It would be kind of like Dan Brown or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Or Spinal Tap.
Yeah. Everything's 11 all the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever I need a little more tension, I just turn it. The other bands will ratchet the tension to 10, but I just put it at 11.
I just take all the knobs and I turn them all to 11.
All to 11.
And there's a few downbeat chapters that are, chapter 19, she gets to Sicily, Tom's in control, and nothing really gets escalated there. And you need that. You need upbeats and downbeats. There is another downbeat chapter, 27, when he talks with the private investigator, McCarran. There are a lot of echoes of the first chapter. They go to a bar. Tom is really worried about getting caught, and there's a question and answer with an older American man. Very, very redolent of the first chapter. And McCarran just buys it. Yeah. He's like, okay. And I think what happened to Highsmith in the second half of this book is and this happens to writers all the time, you get attached to your characters and you kind of want good things to happen to them, and you shy away from those moments when what you really need to be doing is turning up the pressure on them. I do not know what some of those other choices she could have made, but it's not incumbent upon me to come up with those. That's
no. Whenever you're rewriting the book, something went wrong.
Exactly.
Unless you're Anthony Minghella, the screenwriter, and you're taking some good source material and you're making it even better.
Yeah, but I went through and kind of in the second half of the book did a little column per chapter of like, okay, what is the obstacle that Tom has to overcome? So chapter 16, getting rid of the body, he needs to make Freddie seem drunk. In chapter 17, the investigator shows up. He needs to avoid notice while he's in Rome.
I'll say, sorry to interrupt, I would say like all that's pretty good in terms of escalating the danger and the tension. Like this part is pretty good in terms of like, Tom's in trouble and he's got to think fast and all of that.
Exactly. And then he comes out on the idea, how do I avoid detection? I become Tom again. And like, that I think could have been, because those are some of the sections that you really found winning, of Tom realizing that he has to become himself again and not really liking it, and then kind of liking it and sort of buffing Tom Ripley into something more. And that would have been great. But instead we get the bank remittances are forged. And so, okay, we got to do some things with there. Oh, Marge shows back up. We got to deal with her. Maybe I need to beat her to death with my shoe and drop her in the canal. I need to get all of these lies right about Dickie's money and not get caught. Then the rings. The rings show up. I got to come up with a plausible story about the rings. Do I need to kill Marge? Oh no, she solves it for me because she just buys my description. Then McCarran buys the story. And then the goddamn suitcases get discovered. The dreams of Greece are shattered. Will the investigation be reopened? No.
With Tom's fingerprints all over them. Yet another opportunity. I think it's okay if either McCarran or the Italian police were incompetent, but not both, you know? Like, and I want to point to something here, which is that McCarran and the Italian police are both what would have been considered kind of like white ethnics, like non-WASP. And Patricia Highsmith was a WASP, and from what I've read, she was both kind of like Tom, kind of like resented her social class, but also had all the prejudices of a WASP. And I think we're supposed to believe that McCarran is not very competent because he's Irish, and that the Italian police are not very competent because they're Italian. I think, yeah. And I'm hesitant to use the word racist because it's not really race, although it is racist because it's about who the whitest white people are. It is white supremacist, and it's a belief that, yeah, maybe the Irish and Italians they're part of the white club, but they're like, they have to ride coach class in the white boat, you know? And I think we're just supposed to accept that maybe it's possible that Italian police are notoriously... She does say that the French police were better than the Italians. And so maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's a little bit of an anthropological observation she's making. But then in that case, McCarran should be really on the ball, right? You know, like that should ratchet up the stakes. And the other thing that's happening that also to me occasionally makes it good in the second half is that Tom has pangs of guilt. And those are good moments when Tom has pangs of guilt. And I even think it's okay that they're few and far between, because so much of what Tom experiences is repressed and subtextual. So it's okay to me that Tom is not walking around a nervous wreck from guilt all the time. But I think the second half would be better if there was more guilt. But can I read you one of my other favorite passages from the second half, which gets to hopefully I'm not stepping. Okay, so Tom is talking with this sort of friendly English guy he's gotten to know in Venice, Peter. And I
think you might have grabbed. This is going to be great if we have the same passage that we are going to talk about.
Are you okay with me reading it, or would you rather be the one?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. No.
So he's talking with Peter. He has this moment where he realizes that if he needed to, he could probably murder Peter and imitate him. And then he feels bad about it because unlike Dickie and unlike Freddie and unlike Marge, he doesn't resent Peter at all. Peter's been nothing but a sweetheart to him. He likes Peter. And so he has this moment of guilt. And this seems to kind of trigger him realizing some of the enormity of what he did to Dickie. And he says, Peter asks him some question and Tom responds, "Thanks. I'd better stay by myself for a while longer. I miss my friend Dickie. You know, I miss him terribly." He was suddenly near tears. He could remember Dickie's smiles that first day they began to get along, when he had confessed to Dickie that his father had sent him. He remembered their crazy first trip to Rome. He remembered with affection even that half hour in the Carlton bar in Cannes when Dickie had been so bored and silent. But there had been a reason why Dickie had been bored. After all, he had dragged Dickie there. And Dickie didn't care for the Côte d'Azur. Côte d'Azur. If he'd only gotten his sightseeing done by himself, Tom thought, if only he hadn't been in such a hurry and so greedy, if he only hadn't misjudged the relationship between Dickie and Marge so stupidly, or had simply waited for them to separate of their own volition, then none of this would have happened, and he could have lived with Dickie for the rest of his life. Traveled and lived and enjoyed living for the rest of his life, if only he hadn't put on Dickie's clothes that day. I understand, Tommy boy, I really do, Peter said, patting his shoulder. Tom looked up at him through distorting tears. He was imagining traveling with Dickie on some liner back to America for Christmas holiday, imagining being on good terms with Dickie's parents, as if he and Dickie had been brothers. Thanks, Tom said. Came out a childlike blub. I'd really think something was the matter with you if you didn't break down like this, Peter said sympathetically. End of chapter.
It's where she's at her best. You know, I had this passage too, and what I wish the second half of the first of all, I wish the second half of the book were shorter. I don't think we need the same amount of basically denouement as we did with Rising Action and Climax, because the climax happens when he kills Dickie and kills Freddy. Those are the animating climaxes of the book, and everything else is figuring out what happens. The misunderstanding that ends amicably at the end of this chapter between him and Peter is just a masterstroke, where we get to see Tom's guilt and his monstrousness at the same time.
Right, because he's using his guilt and recasting it as mourning and absorbing sympathy for that. He's also, I think we're meant to understand he really is profoundly sad in that moment. He is regretful of what he did. It's the first time he expresses any regret for it. He acknowledges it was kind of his fault, at least in the sense that he was like, he never says, if only I hadn't decided to kill Dickie, but he does say, if only we hadn't been on that terrible trip. And then the other thing that just punches me in the stomach really hard about that section is he imagines living the rest of his life with Dickie, but he still can't admit to himself his attraction. So he's just like brothers. You know, Patricia Highsmith was a lesbian. She's very well acquainted with same-sex attraction. I think we're meant to understand that he is attracted and in love with Dickie, and he still can't admit that. And so even in his fantasy life in which he hadn't murdered Dickie, they would just be like brothers traveling around.
Yeah, I think this book is really about control. And we talked about that last time, the section that he loses control of the boat. And what you're talking about is his unraveling control of his attraction, trying to keep it, under control. And the passage I wanted to read was his dream. This is on in my edition, page 156. It's the end of chapter 17.
Okay.
The scene dissolved in swirling yellow grayness, the color of the sand in Montebello. Tom saw Dickie smiling at him, dressed in the corduroy suit that he had worn in San Remo. The suit was soaking wet, the tie a dripping string. Dickie bent over him, shaking him. I swam, he said. Tom, wake up. I'm all right. I swam. I'm alive. Tom squirmed away from his touch. He heard Dickie laugh at him. Dickie's happy, deep laugh. Tom! The timbre of the voice was deeper, richer, better than Tom had ever been able to make it in his imitations. Tom pushed himself up. His body felt leaden and slow, as if he was trying to raise himself out of deep water. I swam! Dickie's voice shouted, ringing and ringing in Tom's ears as if he had been through a long tunnel. Tom looked around the room, looking for Dickie in the yellow light under the bridge lamp, in the dark corner by the tall wardrobe. Tom felt his own eyes stretched wide, terrified. And though he knew his fear was senseless, he kept looking everywhere for Dickie, below the half-drawn shades at the window and on the floor on the other side of the bed. He hauled himself up from the bed, staggered across the room, and opened a window. Then the other window. He felt drugged. Somebody put something in my wine, he thought suddenly. He knelt below the window, breathing the cold air in, fighting the grogginess as if it were something that was going to overcome him if he didn't exert himself to the utmost. Finally, he went to the bathroom and wet his face at the basin. The grogginess was going away. He knew he hadn't been drugged. He had let his imagination run away with him. He had been out of control.
Mm.
There's
Yeah.
moments like that one, the boat, the passage that you just read, where we get, I think those to be brought up to 11. And I want the sort of like almost farcical nature of like the bumbling Italian investigators and McCarran, who's like this sort of like Peter Sellers-esque kind of like group, and Marge comes across as pathetic. I want less of that. And certainly I don't want one of the final notes to be rung to be again, oh, the suitcases have been discovered. Don't worry about it. Like, I wish the book were 60 pages shorter and more of the stuff that you and I are talking about right now.
I feel like a broken record, but like, I really think that the Minghella movie delivers everything that you're talking about, right? You know,
I think you're totally right. I totally agree.
And one of the ways it fixes it is that Marge actually kind of figures out what happened. And she tries to tell Herbert Greenleaf, and she tries to tell the detective, and they don't believe her because they're just sexist. They're just like, she's hysterical. And you're just like, oh my God, it's so heartbreaking. And I mean, you know, the other thing, well, I don't know if you remember the very last scene from that movie, but you get another moment of, what did you call it? Of climax, of emotional climax, because of what Tom needs to do to escape his predicament in that moment is heartbreaking and heart-wrenching.
Yeah. And I think we're kind of, I don't know, I think we're kind of there.
Well, I guess I thought you were going to say you ended up on the side of this is a good book, even though the character makes me uncomfortable, but that's not necessarily bad. So I was prepared to mount a defense for characters that make you uncomfortable. And
I love characters that make me uncomfortable.
Yeah, but I don't know. You did refer to yourself as being Ripley'd out right now. I mean, I feel like this book got to you in a way that maybe goes beyond. You told me last time that you hated Ripley, and I confessed that I kind of found him charming a little bit, even though I thought what he did was wrong. I spent like the last 2 weeks being like, am I a less evolved moral person than Chris Bagg? Because Chris Bagg is morally correct. And I am morally incorrect here. Like clearly, like, and so I was thinking about that. And I guess, you know, I think there's two things going on. And one is that I guess I do feel fairly comfortable with my instinctual morality. I do hurt people, but usually it's by accident because I'm clumsy and miss subtexts and things like that, or I'm too much of a coward to say directly what I really think, so I allow people to go on thinking the wrong thing for too long in a way that is certainly bad, but not at all malicious. I don't think I'm a malicious person, and I'm comfortable in that. And so maybe part of it is that there is something fun and seductive about being able to deal with the people in your life who bother you and confine you and restrict you and limit your autonomy in a way that breaks the normal social rules. There's a power in that, and it can be fun to imagine yourself doing that from time to time, which is, I think, like the same reason there are a lot of movies about hitmen and, you know, or even like heist movies with jewel thieves and people like that who are breaking the rules to get what they want and sort of living this life. But I do think there is something to a seductive, immoral character. I think there's something about being sucked into that and feeling like, oh, I'm rooting for Ripley to get away with it, or I'm rooting for Walter White to get away with it. I'm assuming you've watched Breaking Bad.
I actually haven't, which is insane.
Okay, well, interesting. So I'll just say, you know the premise of Breaking Bad?
I do.
Listener, a seemingly normal, nice person cooks meth and sells it to make money, and in so doing finds himself committing murder to protect his business. I hope that doesn't give too much away.
Because he's dying of cancer. And that is something that is absent from Tom. We get some sense of Tom's wounds.
Yeah.
We don't know if they are completely accurate because he is unreliable. We don't know if his stories about Aunt Dottie are correct. And in a lot of like movies or books like that, where we end up cheering for the bad guys, the creator has done some sort of effective legwork to make us realize, like, oh, there is an enemy here, and this is actually the protagonist. And I think this is another one in the column of Patricia Highsmith is amazing, in that she is able to craft something that really is so close to being a great book without doing that for Tom.
Yeah.
Like he's just a bad guy, and he wins. And I think probably the background that I am bringing to it as an alcoholic who has done some insanely horrible things while I've been drunk. I enjoyed this book. I read it with like a sort of like with an eye towards craft. I think that a bad person getting away and not having to make amends for the things that he did sticks in my craw a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think that is probably the close to homeness that you're picking up on.
Fair enough. With both this and Breaking Bad, I think the experience I have of it is that sense of being charmed by the person doing the bad thing, often for me at least, as a fairly introspective reader or watcher, is fleeting. So I might feel that way at first, but generally at some point I stop feeling that way. Maybe it's the second time I read it in this case, or with Breaking Bad, that series, I don't want to spoil it too much for you, but the main character has this thing that he often says to justify the things that he's doing, which is, everything I'm doing it for my family. Which one senses he believes at first, but there's enough evidence that that's not entirely true, and that he actually enjoys what he's doing, and he enjoys the power that you feel. And without, again, spoiling, the murders that he does, some of them he seems to be doing, killing bad people for self-defense, but then you get the backstory of some of those people, and you realize that they're doing the things they're doing to protect their business much the same way that he's doing them. And at a certain point, what that makes you start thinking about is maybe actually most criminals are doing things for understandable and relatable reasons out of desperation. And what does that say about me as somebody who doesn't do those things and is judgy about those people? Maybe it just means I haven't been put in that kind of desperate circumstance. Maybe that means, as I've gotten to know our criminal justice system a little bit better in the last few years, that the sense that some people have of contentment that, certain people are in jail for 30 or 40 years or prison, maybe we ought to be thinking about that a little bit, and whether those punishments we're doling out are actually addressing the circumstances that lead to crime and violence. And I think all of that is what good books should be making us think about, right? Like, these are all good things for art to take us to. And
I'm glad Highsmith took me on this ride. I just think that she could have cut a little bit more and actually would have deepened the interest of the book. That's where I kind of end on it.
So do you want to go to trivia?
Sure. Why don't you do yours first?
Okay. We talked a little bit about The Ambassadors by Henry James, and you said that you had dove into the plot, so you should be able to get this one. It's an Ambassadors question. The question is, Tom Ripley is able to ascend in the social ladder in class. He comes into money through essentially murder and forgery and deception. What is the means that the main character, whose name is Louis Stetler, intends to use to also climb the social ladder in the ambassadors.
I think it's marriage.
Yes. Yeah. And what's interesting, and I kind of want to read this novel now, is that it's his fiance who is wealthy, who sends him to Europe. And then while he's there enjoying himself, the guy, his fiance's daughter, who he's supposed to bring back, sets him up with a wealthy European woman who he might marry to also. So it's not only is that his strategy, it's his only strategy. it's the only strategy he seems to have available to him.
I love that is such a Henry James name, Louis Stetler. You know, as the names in this book are top drawer. I can't. They just I mean they're Gatsby-esque. And I think this book does owe a debt to the Great Gatsby.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, my trivia for you. The book ends with a piece of dialogue, like any good piece of writing should end with a piece of dialogue. To a hotel, please, Tom said. Il meglio albergo. Il meglio. Il meglio. Did you look up? Do you know what that means?
Well, albergo is a word I know from cognates that basically means a inn or a hotel. Will you read it to me one more time?
To a hotel, please, Tom said. Il meglio albergo. Il meglio. Il meglio.
Il meglio is 2 words, right? I-L meglio?
I-L space M-E-G-L-I-O.
Oh, man. I'm going to try. I didn't look it up. I'm going to try to puzzle it out, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it. I'm tempted to say it means something like the nearest, you know, which would sort of make sense in this case because Tom doesn't care. But the fact that the porter is yelling it, to me, suggests it's sort of like an infamous hotel. Meglio. What is that? For some reason, the word that's coming to mind is mirage. But
that would fit for this book. That would be perfect if he was saying like take me to the Mirage Hotel, which would be a little you know, a little
on
too
the nose.
Yeah, a little too on the nose. It means the best.
Oh.
He basically says to a hotel, please. Tom said, the best hotel. The best.
Yeah.
I just think it's another masterstroke.
Well, he's euphoric because he got away with it and he got the money and he's wallowing in his luck and fortune.
And what he wants is the best of things. Like that is what Tom is motivated by. And she lands the plane with a slightly shaky and a little repetitive second half in a really wonderful way. And oh my God, those sections with Mrs. Cartwright on the boat to Greece, I also adore. I loved those. Maybe she should be pushed over the edge. I was like, what?
Now, are there any characters in this book who Tom does not at least briefly consider murdering?
It's just, I mean, like, yes, I find him distasteful, but moments like that, the sort of gleeful moments where and then he sort of tosses them away, which means there is a shred of humanity left. So I think that brings us to the end of what we have going for our episode on the talented Mr. Ripley. Thanks for listening, everyone out there. Please don't forget to rate and review the show. That really helps a lot. Again, if you give us a 5-star review, we will read it aloud on the air. You can get in contact with us at jpd@uppermiddlebrow.com and Bagg, Bagg, at uppermiddlebrow.com. And you can visit us on the web at
uppermiddlebrow.com.
Nailed it.